Okay, I think I'm going to go ahead and get started. It is 1 minute after the hour, and since we don't have to physically move between conference rooms, it's probably safe to go ahead and get started. So I am John Grubb, and welcome to my session called Reasons Not to Decouple. I am the Director of Customer Care at Platform SH. I'll get into a little bit of what that entails in just a few minutes, but let's just dive right into it and talk about some of the reasons why you as a developer or an architect or an agency team member might want to decouple or build a decoupled application or a microservices employee microservices architecture. Um, so I think, and I reference this in the description for this particular session, one of the very best reasons and most often cited reasons is being able to serve content to multiple devices, right? So back in the good old days, 10 years ago, there before the really sort of a widespread adoption of mobile devices, kind of like the web view in the browser was really the only view, but that has obviously changed dramatically. Um, very often, sites will want to broadcast data or be able to serve as some sort of an API or backend serving content to different devices that probably are not built in HTML necessarily. So native iPhone apps, native Android apps, things of this nature. And it's much easier, it's much cleaner often to integrate with those platforms if you're just building with their native SDKs and then using an API to communicate with the content that you and your team members or your users or your editors or whomever is actually creating. Um, and whether you're planning on building more than one front end for this website now, it's kind of thought of as a safe sort of future-proof thing to employ on your site. That's part of the reason why Drupal 8, for instance, includes a lot of native sort of JSON API functionality, just with the base install. So that is one good reason, and usually pretty easy to sell to business users, I think. Just kind of future-proofing the site and offering the option to serve different front ends and serve mobile apps. Who doesn't want to serve a mobile app, you know? Um, Performance can be another one. This is not a bad reason. It's debatable, but it's not a bad reason. The thinking being that if you are only loading sort of this thick JavaScript client into the browser once and then making network round trips for just smaller JSON payloads, and not having to refresh the CSS and all the JS every time the browser reloads, the browser doesn't reload, then it can theoretically be a very snappy, almost native kind of experience. Um, Developer happiness is one that if you are a frequent lurker of R Drupal and Reddit, this is really kind of, I think, a lot of the reason why this has become so popular. I was a Drupal themer for quite a while, so I know it. I know it well. But the thought of being able to do something new and just sort of separate concerns out is attractive from just a theoretical or philosophical perspective. And besides, it's nice to learn new things. Um, Most realistically, it's a combo of all of these things. Being able to future-proof the site, being able to offer better performance to the customer, the client. That's a pretty easy sell. And if it comes with a side of developer happiness, or just like you get to learn new things, then hey, that's a bonus. Um, but let's talk about why do developers really decide to build decoupled architectures? Um, It's because new tech is fun, new technology is fun to learn. It's like, this stuff is constantly evolving, this stuff being the internet broadly and the technologies we use to build it. It's constantly evolving. So if you're not the type of person that likes to learn new things every 6 months or every day, this probably isn't the gig for you. And so I'm going to assume, since this is a technology conference, we're all sort of in the boat of liking to learn new things. And these sorts of more modern decoupled architectures definitely fall into that bucket. This is fun stuff to learn. Um, it doesn't hurt that it's good for the resume. I mean, if all you had to put on your resume for the last 10 years was Drupal 6 themer, um, you know, like you might find yourself on a bit of a cul-de-sac with as far as your career progression is going. So, it's great to branch out. It's great to diversify. You learn new things. Um, you know, This applies a bit more to sort of a broader, a larger microservice architecture than I guess it really does what we in the sort of CMS community call a decoupled architecture, which, decoupled is sort of like front end, back end. Microservice architectures, in theory, sort of espouse this philosophy of being able to separate concerns and just have individual teams working on individual pieces of a given project. And that sounds nice. Like theoretically, if one of those pieces took a dump and were broken for a little while, the whole thing wouldn't grind to a halt. In practice, that doesn't usually turn out to be true, but it's a nice idea. And this again, the arguably, in my opinion, the very best reason to build these things is because you need a project. You need a project to learn new things, and so there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But as I was putting together this project, this presentation, I was just kind of thinking about a few things, and I had a question, and sort of like the root question or the root problem with what I feel in my soul when I think about decoupled architectures. And I'll tell you a bit more what I'm talking about. I guess that's the point of this session. But here's a question: like, how often do you run Composer update on your Drupal projects? And as a follow-up, how often do you spend time unbreaking things after you run Composer update on your Drupal projects, or any projects really? Drupal is just a great example because it uses Composer in the 8 branch and uses a lot of different third-party dependencies that are continually updated. Here's another one: how often do you update your npm dependencies? And how often do you spend unbreaking things after that? So really, I was playing with different titles for this thing, and one of them was, if you were aware of all the nuances you were going to meet while building that decoupled application, you would not build that decoupled application. A much snarkier sort of I'm from New Jersey way of saying it was like, if you were really good enough to handle a microservices architecture, you might realize you don't need a microservices architecture, or rather that your client, or more to the point, doesn't need a microservices architecture. In the depths of the night, or actually, I don't know, maybe this is just me hopped up on coffee. Another alternate title I thought of for this presentation was Exotic Technologies Are Literally Satan. I gave myself quite a laugh when I came up with that one. And then, Hieronymus Bosch, who doesn't love some of that in your technology presentations. So anyway, hopefully I don't offend anyone with that one. But this is Reasons Not to Decouple. Welcome. I am John Grubb, the Director of Customer Care, Platform SH. We are a cloud hosting vendor. I'm Johnny Grubb on Twitter. Feel free to hop on there. J Grubb on the Platform SH Slack. We have a public Slack channel where you can come and ask us questions and generally say hello. I'm J Grubb on there, and generally everywhere else, I'm J Grubb as well. So a little bit about myself and sort of like why I'm spouting off about all this. I've been a Drupal developer since roughly after 2009, sometime around shortly after Drupal 6 came out. I had this great, I was like in a band at the time. We had this website I wasn't happy with, and I was like, gosh, why is it so hard to build a website? Why can't we find a guy? It would be really cool if we had there was some sort of a tool that made it easy to build websites, and that was how I found Drupal. As luck would have it, I was the first one to have that idea. So that's when I found Drupal. Fast forward a few years, I actually built a couple of, took part in building a couple of like early decoupled architectures. I worked for a publishing company at the time. We had a big Drupal 7 multi-site that we hosted on Acquia. We wanted to provide sort of a more mobile experience, and I took the opportunity to learn some new things and grow my resume and built a mobile app, basically, quote unquote, using Angular back in the good old days, and Drupal 7. I've been working for Platform SH for the last 4 years. I started off as a solutions architect, so I decided to explicitly sort of take a step out of being just a developer and apply some of the skills that I had learned over the years with Drupal and with just web architectures and cloud hosting generally, and apply them a little bit more in a business domain. So I started there as a solutions architect, which basically involves sussing out incoming prospects and businesses that might want to partner with us, and figuring out how we can help them with their business needs, specifically as to do with the tools that we build at Platform SH. I now currently lead the customer care team, which is basically comprised of two smaller teams, the customer success managers, which are really sort of akin to like account managers if you are a contract signed customer of ours, and the customer success engineers. And what they are in charge of is onboarding our enterprise customers. And so that's really what a lot of this talk is about. I myself have personally onboarded many dozen of our enterprise clientele across a bunch of different technologies. So you get to see all kinds of interesting things coming in the door when you work for vendors such as myself. And so that's really sort of the background or the basis upon which I've formed some of these opinions. So full disclosure, I started off as a developer loving these things, and now I work for what I used to call somewhat sarcastically in my head and sometimes out loud vendor scum. Now that I'm vendor scum myself, I've seen lots of things come in the door that frankly some should not be. So this is a cautionary tale. Welcome aboard. So really, if I had to boil this entire talk down, this would be basically a cautionary tale about dependencies and dependency hell, dependency creep. In not just places that you're thinking about it. So let's just start with the obvious ones. Okay, managing dependencies is difficult, usually thankless, often unbilled work unless you are an agency who specifically goes into the maintenance game, which is smart, by the way. But if you are say an agency team who primarily goes after new builds and that's your client base, that's your thing, managing dependencies is usually not something you get paid for. During the development cycle, you're going to have to update dependencies, dependencies such as your composer libs that you're using in your project. You're going to have to update those things. And you're probably not going to be able to bill for that unless you've done this enough to know, like, how much you need to bill for that. It is not usually, but often thankless, unpaid work. I mean, dependencies go out of date all the time. Security releases are released in the middle of the night. You wake up the next day or sometimes a month later and realize you've got a bunch of outdated dependencies. God willing, you don't wake up 2 years later, realize you've got a bunch of outdated dependencies, because if a site has been left untended for that length of time, you're going to have a real mess and a really big job. And getting that kind of money out of clientele, or the boss, for instance, if you're an in-house development team for some company, I mean, that's not releasing new features. That's invisible, just maintenance work that nobody that unfortunately does not get the laudits it deserves. And so anyway, this is a kind of a conversation about dependencies. So Composer and Drupal, for instance, or Composer and WordPress, or Composer in any PHP application. Thank God Composer came along, honestly, because back in the pair days, it was kind of a fraught process of updating PHP dependencies. And so, yeah, thank goodness for Composer. At least it gives you some command line functionality and builds a lock file so that you can ensure that you and your fellow developers on your team have at least the same versions of these dependencies. NPM, more recently added a lock file. I think the last time I gave this talk actually was at Decoupled Days in 2018 in New York, and I'm not sure if Yarn was a big thing at that point or not, but Yarn introduced the concept of a lock file to the NPM, the Node.js ecosystem. So thank goodness for that. But yeah, I mean, the Node ecosystem is something else as far as the sort of the dependency graph. That's what the Mandelbrot here is all about, because in practice you might want to install one Node library and discover that it pulls in 15,000 other Node libraries by the time it's done. So those things, just the quantity of dependencies you've got in projects with Node.js involved, is really kind of outrageous and makes me glad that I've moved into infrastructure. So buckle up for that. But then there's also, now we're going to get into the dependencies that I don't think most people, or that are often overlooked at the front of a project. So if you are going to build a decoupled architecture, you're very explicitly going to have basically a front end and a back end app in the most naive sort of interpretation of a decoupled architecture. You're probably going to have something like you know, a Drupal 8 backend where your content editors are going to work, or maybe a Wagtail backend. I'm definitely going to check that out. I saw that talk earlier today, and I actually saw Wagtail when it first came out in 2013, and it looks like it's come really far. Part of its native functionality, it looks like, is being able to serve APIs. So that's pretty cool. So that would serve as your backend, and then you're going to write a front end client, probably in React or some React derived framework like Nuxt or Gatsby or you name it, right? And so now you have this explicit dependency between your front end and your back end. You know, your front end may be decoupled. Maybe when it pulls all that content over from the back end, it functions great and is snappy, but it's got to get that content in the first place. And so there is an explicit dependency now between these two applications, not just the NPM dependencies within your Node app and the Composer dependencies within your PHP app, or the pip dependencies within your Django app. You know, you've got these basically two, at this point, sub dependencies that have a greater, more global dependency on each other to actually be able to serve your users. Don't forget about those users, y'all. That's why we're here. So that's a dependency. Your dependency on your developers. Now, you know, sort of one of the pie in the sky things about separation of concerns is that you can have, in theory, on your team, some Drupal backend people, or your, you know, your Ruby on Rails developers who are really just in the weeds, not really presentation-minded front end developers. You can start to separate out concerns on your team. So you can have your backend developers and your front end developers. Problem with that, though, is that now you need back-end developers and front-end developers. And if either one of those decides to go and find another job somewhere, because that does happen sometime, now you've got to, you know, I mean, like, sure, yeah, you're documenting the heck out of these things. And so it's easy to ramp up new team members and get them fully acclimated to these projects that they haven't been working on. But, you know, sometimes you forget, and sometimes, you know, you don't have a team member you can just drop into a thing. And now instead of having to acclimate developer into one project, you kind of have to, at least in part of their mind share, you have to ramp them into two. Not to mention, both of these front end and back end types are very expensive, generally speaking. And so now you basically gotta have both of these people, unless you're gonna have one person do both. And if you're gonna have one person do both, that should throw up a big red flag for you. Unless you're that person, then by all means go for it. But you're sowing the seeds of hurt. The dogs are here now, so all right, and now they're gone. Cool. But yeah, you've got another explicitly even more global on, you know, the NPM composer, the network sort of, you know, the dependency between your front end and back end. You've got now dependencies on two different groups of developers that you're going to need to move this project forward. And so I'd like to take a moment here and talk about the distributed monolith, which the dogs are going nuts. Excuse me. The distributed monolith is, I didn't come up with that term, but it very accurately describes what a lot of decoupled architectures actually are. You know, you've got a front end and a back end, and if you only have, you know, if you're only serving one or two front ends, my dogs are just freaking out right now. I'm glad I went and got the good headphones, and the good microphone. But anyway, oh gosh darn it. Yeah, so if you've just got basically a front end and a back end, I mean, that's cool that you've got this separation concerns, but really, I mean, you've got a distributed monolith at that point. I mean, it's like one doesn't work without the other. Yeah, sure, you can have like content editors in your back end adding new content and stuff like that. But your users who are coming to your site aren't going to see anything unless both of these things are functioning, you know, are available essentially. And so this little diagram that I've got here, this is, you know, I guess this is from, it looks like a rough diagram of a Ruby on Rails request, but this could be really any sort of model view controller sort of diagram of how things flow through the system. And as I was putting this together and looking for sort of diagrams of request and response, I found this one. I was like, and it occurred to me that the distributed monolith, and this is where it gets really scary, y'all. The distributed monolith brings the, you know, it brings the value that it brings, but it also, and this is the part that gets overlooked in my opinion, it also basically takes this this diagram here, browser hits sort of like a front end controller, hits, you know, your controller classes, which can speak back to the model, pull data, push that data, over to the view for rendering and then send those responses back, it actually stretches all this stuff out over the network. And that's where things get really scary for you as a development team and for us as your vendor partner. Because things going over the network take orders of magnitude longer than they do when they're just running on localhost or a server, like a given production server. So whereas in the past with the monolith, where a Ruby on Rails application or Drupal application, all these things would happen on localhost and these network requests and all these different, basically the process, the paths that your requests take down to be turn back into responses, all that can happen basically at the speed of light and the transistors within the CPUs of the thing. But if you pull these pieces apart and start separating these concerns and separating them over the network, then you have a whole different ballgame. And that's what I mean by distributed monolith. It's, the network latency is not something that, that we think about often. So, another thing that, especially new developers to these kind of things or new architects to microservice and distributed applications don't necessarily think about is that caching is no less important when you have a distributed monolith than it is when you have just a flat out Drupal site. It is no less important for performance to be able to cache things. But now you have two different points. Where do you cache these things? You have two or more different points. Where do you cache these things? Your cache strategy gets infinitely more complicated than just clicking the cache button in the backend of Drupal, for instance, or WordPress. And so when a content editor updates a piece of whatever, how do you clear those things out? Where do you clear those things out? How do you make sure that the front end, if it's being cached, say on a CDN, how do you make sure that the front end is cached when the back end is updated so that your users out there see updated content, your editors will see updated content? This is the stuff people do not think about until it's 2 weeks before go live and they're like, oh, my thing performs poorly. What can I do? Well, push your dates back and get a proper caching strategy in place. So I would like to give at this point a special mention to GraphQL, since we are talking about decoupled applications. And since the next breath, or at least in adjacent paragraphs when describing distributed applications, and in adjacent paragraphs to React, which was a Facebook technology initially, in the next paragraph comes along GraphQL, another interesting, useful query language, sort of API query language, also wrought upon this world by Facebook. It has its values. It's really brilliant. It's a way that you can have one API endpoint respond to any number of different requests. So rather than having basically, static REST endpoints where they will take a certain type of request and give a certain format of response, you can essentially have one endpoint that will fulfill any sort of request that your user might have or your front end application might have. So the benefits to developer velocity on the front end and the back end are obvious, at least as soon as you start working with it. You can have flexible requests and specify flexible responses all from one endpoint. It's brilliant from a developer velocity standpoint, but from a performance standpoint, it's worth a thought. And given that I work for your friendly neighborhood hosting vendor, performance is really like kind of my job, to ensure that customers' apps don't just run, but they run well. And so GraphQL is an interesting thing because it is dynamic by definition. It is dynamic by definition on the same endpoints. There are some implementations of GraphQL out there in the wild that operate via post request. The initial version of the Drupal 8 GraphQL module actually operated exclusively via post requests, which may not mean anything to you. But what it means to me is that those requests are inherently uncacheable, even if it's the same request coming over and over and over again, unless you are going to basically reconfigure your caching layer, whether it's Varnish or a CDN or Drupal itself. Most things by default will not cache post requests. It makes sense that it would be a post request because you're basically you're asking for a piece of JSON, or you're specifying your request in a JSON format and expecting back a response in whatever format you specify. And so it does make sense that it would be in post, but it also makes it basically uncacheable. More updated versions, and I have looked into this lately because we have customers coming in with GraphQL implementations that we have to take care of, and more recent versions of the Drupal 8 GraphQL module actually operate via Git, which is awesome. So that's like at least step one, but you're still specifying basically dynamic responses that you want, which is, it's inherently difficult to cache. Unless you're just requesting the same stuff over and over, in which case, why are you using GraphQL, By the way, these are my opinions, not those of my employer. Should have said that at the beginning, though, huh? So anyway, this is just a use case that I have seen fairly recently, actually. There's a front-end application built on, I think it was Nuxt.js. It could be anything really, Gatsby, whatever. And in order to tie together content from editors that was entered into Drupal and some sort of dynamic scheduling information from some other third-party web service, they had a GraphQL server sitting in the middle. And so now, in order to serve first point, in order to serve user requests to the front end app, request to a GraphQL server, stitches together requests to two different backends, and then sends it back. So you can start to understand where network latency and caching are things that become really, really important when you actually host these things out in the wild. And so, yeah, and also, where do you cache these things? Like, you've got multiple points where you can cache things. If you cache the GraphQL server, aren't you somewhat defeating the purpose of GraphQL? Because the purpose is for it to be dynamic and for it to fetch real-time information. And so, this particular GraphQL server was using a Node.js project called Apollo, which seems actually pretty mature GraphQL server implementation in Node.js. Has a really brilliant sort of dynamic caching strategy built into it. So you can specify pieces of your response to be to have, say a 5-second TTL on them, and then other pieces, if it's okay that they live a little longer, they can have a 30-second or 30-minute TTL, so that you can actually cache things in the GraphQL server dynamically. But at the end of the day, these are really business decisions that you're making as a developer about how long to cache things. And it's just fraught. It's a slippery slope, So GraphQL development velocity benefits are obvious, but just make sure at the beginning of your implementation, in your planning phase, you're asking the business, you're asking the customer the questions about how long these different pieces of data need to be, how real time do they need to be? Because that can make all the difference in performance at the end of the day. So moving on. Oh gosh, this is where it starts getting actually fun. So the development process, if you've got a distributed monolith or a decoupled application, how do you keep the front end and the back end in sync? Part of the appeal of a decoupled application is that you're basically kind of able to run independently. You're able to do things a little bit more concurrently. So you can say update a piece of data, you can update the way that piece of data formats or whatever on the front end without necessarily involving backend developers to deal with theming code down in the guts of Drupal or something like that. But how do you ensure that the backend is serving the data to the front end that you need in order to be able to keep up with whatever the business user's request is, right? How do you keep the front end and the back end in sync if these two things depend on each other? How do you keep them in sync across development branches? I won't get into Platform SH's value add, but you've got development environments that are served over development URLs. When you're making updates on your front end application, where is that front end application in development? Where is it pulling its data from? Is it pulling it from production? Is it pulling it from a development environment that the backend is hosted? How many of those different development environments do you have? There's many details that start to spider out once you have two things that you have to babysit in order to move the appearance of one thing forward. Like I said a minute ago, what if the front end depends on a backend feature change? You now got to deal with two different applications development processes speaking together, being deployed efficiently. And that brings me to my next question, or my next point, which is the development process. The deployment process. which is a big part of what we do at Platform SH, is help you with trying to make this stuff a little bit less of a panicky thing. Most times we succeed. If the front end depends on a back end feature, how do you roll these out without losing your mind? You have to deploy two applications now at the same time, and so it's just basically it's a panicky time. It's not easy. So I just implore all of you to think about this before you begin on that build, and start prancing down the path of building a decouple application. So yeah, I mean, this is kind of like the question: are you really sure about this? There are almost innumerate. There are places for the places where the devil can hide in the details once you are dealing with two or more different applications in order to fulfill this build. They're just like there are lots of them, and so just parting words, and then we'll get to some Q&A or some discussion, or I can just let you off and give you a nice 25-minute break before the next session. But just some parting advice from me, the director of the onboarding team at your friendly cloud hosting vendor. Just for God's sake, when you're in the development and the planning phase, just think about these things. Think about network latency between the front end to the back end. Think about your deployment strategy. Think about how you're going to get one thing shipped without having to ship the other thing at the same time. Think about what kind of updates and what your plan's going to be for when you can avoid those situations. And a front end change depends on a back end change or vice versa. Think about these things as early as you can and plan for them in the planning phase. Don't keep things in your laptops for the love of all that is holy. Deploy to things out there in the wild. Deploy to your hosting environment. Make sure you've got some cloud hosting environments that will simulate or give you a more realistic idea of what that network latency and pulling these things apart into different pieces. Give you an idea of the cost that actually incurs on your performance. This will hopefully force you to think about your caching strategy as part of your development process instead of a thing that you leave until 3 days before go live. Deploy early, deploy often. This will help you just practice and get used to these things and how the thing performs out in the wild across the network. And lastly, especially if you have not shipped the exact architecture that you're planning for at this new build, if you do not already have prior experience in this domain, and few of us do, frankly, because this is new technology that's constantly changing, budget time to figure these things out. Basically take all the estimates that you would have, all the different pieces that you would have had for just a monolithic single framework application, and double or triple those estimates, especially for your early ones, because you are going to need more time to figure these things out. So yeah, that is the actually end of the talk. So I hope some of this has been useful, and I am not 100% sure. Hopefully Joan, the moderator, can help me figure out. I see that I have 12 attendees in the room, so that's pretty cool, but I'm not exactly sure how to unmute people's apps, or unmute people's thingamabobs. So if there's any questions, I guess just drop them into the question box down here, and I'll get to them. And maybe I'll take a breath, huh?
Hi, John. Can you check the question section? We have 2 listings.
This part is just a comment. Anything here, but this part of the comment is an annotation, and that
Front end perform? Wait.
Going to unmute. There we go. Sorry, I don't know. My thing went muted for a second and I wasn't able to unmute it. So can you hear me, Joan?
Yes.
Okay, for some reason, I don't actually see the questions. I'm not sure why.
Did you press down on the toggles?
Yeah, I just don't think that it's getting sent. So, can you check the chat for the control panel?
The chat for the control panel.
In the control panel.
Aha, there's chat. Okay. Oh, wait, I only see you. Okay, is this a question? Yeah, okay, cool. Have I seen headless projects that should not have been built? Heck yeah, why do you think I'm here? So yeah, I mean, this is one of the thoughts that I've had while putting this together or while, running this particular team. Okay, cool, thanks, Joan. I've kind of got this now.
Okay.
Yeah, have I seen headless projects that should not have been built? Yes, I mean, yes, without a doubt. I mean, that should not have been built is kind of a strong way of putting it, but that could have been built as just a single monolith and would have hidden all of these sins that I have unearthed for you on this presentation. Yeah, absolutely. Just the fact of having the sort of whatever you want to call Drupal or the sort of the entire application be within one box, or at least within boxes that are very close to each other in terms of the request being fulfilled and turned into a response. Just having that stuff in localhost or somewhere where you don't incur network latency between these different pieces hides a world of sin. So yeah, definitely. That's just my opinion. So, oh, Peter, welcome. I'm not able to see who's here. So yeah, thanks for the question. By the way, rocking my shirt, Central Jersey Drupal group represent. So let's see, in a Gatsby project, might you address the cost of Drupal devs by using a simpler headless CMS, since you don't need rendering capabilities beyond isomorphic React? Well, I'll be honest, those are some, I gotta infer, I gotta use inference to, I have to use the powers of, of extrapolation to understand precisely what you're talking about, because I have gotten out of the game, essentially, of building websites. And so isomorphic React presumably means, well, whatever, this entire question means that, yeah, you could probably use something simpler than Drupal devs. Yeah, for sure. I have looked into Gatsby numerous times because it looks like a really cool tool for ingesting data from different sources and sort of mashing it up and building a website out of different data sources, and that's an awesome capability to provide. And so yeah, if you are, if it's a simple publishing site and you can get away with something with less sort of overhead and lower developer cost than Drupal, yeah, definitely. We just happen to be at what formerly was Drupadelphia. So, a lot of my presentations and a lot of just my sort of thinking is Drupal centric, just given my background. But yeah, that is actually one wonderful thing about a decoupled application is theoretically you could entirely swap out your backend to something simpler if you decided that Drupal was just too heavy or too expensive or whatever. Yeah, that is definitely part of the business case of decoupled applications. And Peter, hopefully you heard my question or the answer to your question. Are there any others? Let me unfold the questions tab here. No, I'm still not getting them. Need examples? I'm wondering, Peter, if you're going to give me examples of headless projects that should not have been built, or if you want me to give you examples of headless projects that should not have been built, because I certainly can't do that. Not especially on this particular medium. When we meet again some sunny day, when I can come down to Princeton to a meetup, we could talk. So are there any more questions, Joan? Yeah, no, sorry. That feels not like a thing I can do. Sorry. Peter's saying, was hoping for some examples from you. Sorry, not this time, Peter. Maybe in my younger days, but this is actually older, chiller me now. So let that blow your mind. All right, groovy. Thank you, Joan, for moderating. Thank you, everybody, for coming. This is actually really fun. Never given one of these before. I guess most of us haven't. So anyway, thanks very much. Y'all stay safe out there, and hope to see some of you in person in the future. And thank you again to Joan, and thank you to Anson and everybody who put this thing together. This is really amazing, actually. So yeah, stay safe. Thank you, and we'll meet again.